Oh, and of course the same thing right the way around the rest of the world.
Yes.
Australia has the unique marsupial fauna. New Zealand has no mammals at all except bats, which could fly there obviously, and so birds filled the niches that would otherwise have been filled by mammals.
Right. The argument from imperfect design.
This is fascinating. In a way it comes back to what I was saying about embryology. Animals bear the stamp of history in their form. They have the legacy of history. You can tell that whales must once upon a time have had terrestrial ancestors. All sorts of things indicate that. And in some cases this really does amount to bad design. Humans frequently suffer from back pain because our ancestors walked on all fours. And when we modified to walk on our hind legs, this was done by gradual stages. So we are four-footed animals that have been changed to rising up on our hind legs. And that was an imperfect way to do it. A better way, a real designer would have started with a fresh drawing board, with a clean sheet of paper, and redesigned us from the bottom up, instead of which we were modified. And so we bear the stamp of history, which gives rise to pain. There's a nerve which I discussed called the recurrent laryngeal, which all mammals have, and it goes from the brain to the larynx. But instead of going directly there, it goes down into the chest, loops its way around one of the main arteries leading from the heart, and then goes back up again to the larynx. This is a ridiculous detour. No engineer would have done that, especially not for something like a giraffe, where, as I've seen in a section that I actually took part in, the nerve goes racing straight past the larynx on its way down, goes within inches of the larynx, goes down into the chest, does a hairpin bend, loops straight back up again to the larynx. And that is a ludicrous piece of bad design.
Yes, and a very telling argument against the intelligent design argument. What about the argument from cruel competition?
Well, I have a chapter called Arms Races and Evolutionary Theodicy. It is arms races between, for example, predators and prey, or parasites and hosts, that have led to the detailed perfecting. We've talked about bad design, but there's also very good design, and it comes about through natural selection in arms races between, say, predators and prey, or parasites and hosts. And the idea is that the better a predator gets at chasing prey, the better the prey have to get at running away from predators. And this escalates. So you get extreme running speeds in both cheetahs, for example, and the gazelles that they pursue. And there are other aspects of arms races. In all cases, what happens is that the arms race forces the animals to divert resources into the arms race itself and away from other aspects of life, like looking after the young or something of that sort. There have to be always compromises between the different parts of the animal's life. And the arms race forces an economic shift of resources towards servicing the arms race. There's an element of futility about that. One feels if only the gazelles and the cheetahs could somehow sit down around a conference table and work out nobody's going to run faster than so-and-so. The number of gazelles that get eaten will still be the same, but they won't have to spend so much energy in running, and nor will the cheetahs. It doesn't work like that, needless to say. There are no trade union bargaining arrangements. It works by ruthless, cruel natural selection. It is cruel. Nature has no regard to suffering. The perfection that we see in the body of a cheetah or the body of a gazelle is bought at a cost of generations, countless generations of suffering, actually on both sides, not just the prey side, because of course plenty of cheetahs didn't make it, starved to death because they weren't quite fast enough because of the way the arms race was going.
Well, thank you very much. That's a good summary of the main arguments of the book. Now another kind of question. Two parts. Do you know any religious people who are evolutionists? And do you know any non-religious people who are creationists?
Certainly there are religious people who believe in evolution, no question. And I mean, any decent bishop or archbishop or cardinal believes in evolution. So yes, that's certainly very, very common. The other way round, any atheists who are creationists, they couldn't be, could they? I mean, there'd be nothing to do with creating. It's kind of a contradiction.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Richard, as I read you, you have two main intellectual motivations: wonder at the life in the world and wonder at the powers of the mind to understand the world and to make creative use of the world we understand. In Unweaving the Rainbow, you critique poets who reject science as the death of wonder, and you suggest science could actually increase the wonder. And in your recent work, you critique those religious folk who inhibit, as you see it, the powers of the mind and the wonder of the way things really are. Could you elaborate a little on this sense of wonder?
Well, very well put, if I may say so. I'm not sure that I can do any better than that. Science is, of course, wonderful because the world is wonderful, and it's almost unbelievable what has happened in the world, especially with respect to life. And the cosmos itself is wonderful enough because it's so vast, it's old and yet not infinitely old. We know how old it is, something like 13 billion years old. The galaxies are huge. The distances between them are such that any kind of news of any sort would take millions of years to cross from one place to another. When you're looking out at the stars, you're looking back in time, back a different length of time for each of the stars. So that's wonderful enough. And yet the blind inanimate forces of physics, which pervade most of the universe, have, at least on this planet and possibly on other planets, produced this astonishing phenomenon which is called life, culminating in at least one being which is capable of seeing what's happened, working out what's happened, and marveling at it, namely our own. And we now know how that happened, not in detail. There are gaps waiting to be filled, but we know in principle how it happened. And that itself is a glorious fact. It's glorious because we're here to appreciate it, and it's glorious in itself. It's a very, very simple idea, Darwinian evolution by natural selection, the non-random survival of randomly varying coded messages, coded information, which has the power to manipulate the probability that it will get replicated. And that process, that generating procedure, which is purely natural, there's no design about it, is powerful enough to produce giraffes and kiwis and moas and kangaroos and camels and oak trees and everything that we see as all making a living in different ways, all doing fundamentally the same thing, which is passing on their DNA, but doing it in radically different ways, whether absorbing sunlight, as in the case of plants, climbing very high in order to get to the sunlight, as in the case of the particular plants we call trees, as in herbivores eating plants, as in carnivores eating herbivores, parasites eating everybody, some animals digging, some swinging through the treetops, some swimming, some flying. It's all laid out for us to see. What could be a better, what could be a richer vein to mine for a poet than that? I'm sure there are other excellent topics for poets, but this is something that should not be neglected.
Right. It sounds as though the strategy of your new children's book is very much dealing with that idea of wonder. You're presenting the myths and then showing that the scientific facts are actually more wonderful.
Yes, my children's book does do myths first and then does the scientific answer. I'm not trying to downplay the wonder of the myths. I mean, they are very beautiful, some of them. And it's nice to think back into the history when people, if people ever did believe them, I'm not sure they really did in many cases, but you'd know more about that than I. That is aesthetically pleasing, but I hope I can make the science even more so, and genuinely aesthetically pleasing, not dry and dull and arid, as some people would wrongly have it.
You have a strongly ethical disposition toward your work and towards science. You write in The Blind Watchmaker that had there not been a Darwinian explanation for complex design, you'd have believed in God. Would you have been a preacher 150 years ago, the Reverend Richard Dawkins, D.D., drawing people's attention to the wonder of the natural world and God's instilling us with a capacity to understand these wonders?
Yes, I did write that, and I mean, it's probably true that I would have been a preacher of some sort. I don't know. I actually think, though, with hindsight, it's not a good argument. I mean, even without Darwin, it never was a good argument that design. At the time when I wrote that, I sort of thought that the beauty, the elegance of life would have forced me to believe in design. But strictly, it's an illogical argument because, of course, you haven't explained anything, because you've still left unexplained the existence of the designer. And philosophers knew that even before Darwin came along. But it was rather unsatisfying because they weren't able to provide a good explanation. They knew that God was a bad explanation. They knew there had to be something better than that. They didn't know what it was. And it was Darwin who came along and provided the better explanation.
How important to you are the ethics of science, and how would you compare them with the ethics of religion?
Well, there are two parts to that question, really. Science has its own ethics, which are actually rather strict. Truthfulness is extremely important to scientists, because the whole scientific enterprise breaks down. If scientists start fiddling their figures, if scientists start making up data for the sake of career advancement or something of that sort, the entire process breaks down. Science is carefully policed, not by an official police, but unofficially. Experiments that at least are important get repeated by other scientists, so you don't get away with cheating forever. But an awful lot of science is not regarded as sufficiently earth-shattering for others to bother to repeat it. So if you look through the journals, you will see plenty of reports of science which are never going to be repeated because there's just too much to do. And so it would be possible.
But it's important that they're in principle repeatable.
That's right, they're in principle repeatable. Somebody could come along and repeat them. If there is cheating, and there certainly is, that there are some bad eggs in any group, that if there is cheating, that completely undermines the entire enterprise. If you can't believe somebody when he says, I took 100 rabbits and I released 50 of them into this enclosure and 50 into that enclosure. If you can't believe what he said, then the whole enterprise becomes absolutely pointless. So scientists do have a very strong code of ethics where it comes to honesty, and for honestly trying to see the other side, for not advocating a point of view. Lawyers are paid to advocate a point of view. They may not actually be paid to cheat and lie, but they are paid to put the best spin they possibly can on one case or on the other case. Now, scientists are fallible, and they to some extent do that, but it's thought to be bad form if a scientist does that. A scientist is supposed at least to try to see both sides of the thing and not to advocate a case too passionately. If a scientist advocates a case too passionately, he'll be regarded with suspicion, whereas a lawyer will be made a QC and a knight. So that I think is an important difference. But the other part of the question is, can you derive morals from science? Can science tell you what is moral? And it can't, but it can help you to think straight about things. So science can't tell you whether it's wrong to steal or kill. But science can tell you that you're being inconsistent if you regard it as wrong to, say, kill tiny single-celled embryos, but at the same time you're quite cheerfully happy to eat a cow. There is an inconsistency there. Science can't tell you it's wrong to eat cows, but it can tell you that it's inconsistent to object to killing human embryos on the one hand, while at the same time killing cows, because cows are so much more capable of knowing that they're suffering, of feeling pain, of feeling fear, feeling dread, and clearly human embryos are not. So the scientific way of thinking, which is often called just moral philosophy, I mean, it's the application of logic to moral questions. You can go a long way with the scientific way of thinking to uncover inconsistencies and to produce a coherent set of morals, although ultimately science can't tell you what's moral, but nor can religion. I mean, if we took religious morals seriously, we'd all be stoning adulteresses to death and stoning people who break the Sabbath to death. So we don't, as a matter of fact, get our morals from religion, thank goodness.